Thank you, Madam Speaker. At a time when Canadians are struggling to put food on their tables, when the dream of home ownership in Canada is just that, a dream for many young Canadians, and when our country is plagued by so many other serious challenges brought upon us by the failed policies of this incompetent and reckless Liberal government, we are here this afternoon continuing debate on this government's failure to live up to its responsibilities and your order, Speaker, to produce documents, important documents, pertaining to the Sustainable Development Technology Canada Green Slush Fund scandal. SDTC was established by the Government of Canada in 2001. As a federally funded foundation, it was responsible for the approval and disbursement of over $100 million annually in taxpayer funds to help Canadian companies develop and deploy sustainable technologies. For many years, SDTC operated responsibly and earned a generally good reputation for its work. However, that all changed in 2019 when former Liberal Industry Minister Navdeep Bains appointed Annette Verschuren as chair of SDTC. The issue at hand was a matter of conflict of interest. Verschuren was an entrepreneur who was already receiving SDTC funding through one of her companies, and now she was appointed by this Liberal government to hold responsibilities overseeing those very same SDTC funds, the same funds her company was receiving. That fact alone should have sounded alarm bells and red flashing lights to alert everyone in the government about the obvious conflict of interest at hand. In fact, it was no secret. The Minister, the Prime Minister's office, and the Privy Council office all knew, and they were warned of the risks associated with appointing a conflicted chair. Yet these warnings fell on deaf ears and indifference, as Verschuren was appointed by the Liberal minister anyways. How can you tell a government has lost its moral compass when it makes poor decisions like this one without concern for doing the right thing and without fear of consequences? Only 2 years later, Minister Bains announced in January 2021 that he had decided to step away from politics and not run again in the upcoming federal election. That same year, SDTC entered into a 5-year, $1 billion agreement with the Department of Innovation, Science and Economic Development. Fast forward to the fall of 2024, and it's clear that the Liberals are trying desperately to run away and wash their hands of this mess, one in which they laid the foundation for through their own actions, and especially after the Auditor General released a scathing report about SDTC in June of 2024. The AG found massive issues at SDTC, which resulted in the current Minister of Industry, the Honourable Member for St. Maurice Champlain, abolishing the SDTC and immediately transferring its funds over to the National Research Council of Canada instead. These are truly astonishing developments in just 3 years for something this Liberal government doesn't want to talk about anymore. So what did the AG find that was so bad to cause all this carnage? In June 2024, the AG found that SDTC demonstrated, and I quote, significant lapses in governance and stewardship of public funds, end quote. Nearly 20% of the SDTC projects examined by the AG were in fact ineligible, based on the government's own rules, for funding with a total price tag of $59 million. There were also 90 instances where the SDTC ignored conflict of interest provisions while awarding $76 million to various projects. Indeed, the AG found 63 cases where the SDTC agency directors voted in favor of payments to companies in which they had declared conflicts. The AG report concluded, again, quote, not managing conflicts of interest, whether real, perceived, or potential, increases the risk that that an individual's duty to act in the best interest of the foundation is affected, particularly when making decisions to award funding, end quote. It also blamed the government's Minister of Industry, whose ministry or department did not sufficiently monitor the contribution agreements with SDTC. But believe it or not, it gets worse. Far, far worse. Since June, the Auditor General found that directors had awarded funding to projects that were ineligible and where conflicts of interest existed. The Auditor General found that over $300 million in taxpayers' money was paid out in over 180 cases where there was potential conflict of interest, where Liberal appointed directors funneling monies to companies they own. Time after time, this Liberal government and its Prime Minister has shown total contempt for Canada's ethic laws. In fact, the Prime Minister himself has been found the subject of 3 ethics investigations and found guilty of breaking ethics laws twice. This Liberal government allows the culture of law breaking to persist, as 6 Liberals have been found guilty of breaking ethics laws. They've gone through these ethical scandals before. That's why they're withholding these documents, breaching parliamentary privilege, and trying desperately to sweep this mess under the rug and move on to the next thing. But common sense Conservatives are not going to let them get away with it, Speaker. We're holding this corrupt Liberal government to account. They will be held responsible for their carelessness, recklessness, and indeed corruption. That's why on June 10th, 2024, the House of Commons adopted the following motion proposed by common sense Conservatives on this important matter. And it read that the House order the government, Sustainable Development Technology Canada, SDTC, and the Auditor General of Canada each to deposit with the Law Clerk and Parliamentary Council within 30 days of the adoption of this order the following documents created or dated since January 1st, 2017, which are in its or her possession, custody, or control. The motion then details what documents were to be supplied and then directed that the Law Clerk and Parliamentary Council shall provide forthwith any documents received by him pursuant to this order to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. This common sense Conservative motion passed with the support from the New Democrats, Green Party, and Bloc Québécois. Only the Liberals opposed it. To be clear, nothing in the motion orders the RCMP to conduct an investigation. The House is simply asking that documents be turned over to the RCMP. 30 days came and went, and instead of complying with the adopted motion, federal departments outright refused the House order or provided heavily redacted documents citing provisions in the Privacy Act or the Access to Information Act. Speaker, this is not a good look. Further, nothing in the House order contemplated redactions to documents being made by this government. That's because the House of Commons enjoys the absolute and unfettered power to order the production of documents that is not limited by statute. These powers are rooted in the Constitution Act of 1867 and the Parliament of Canada Act. In response to the Liberal government's failure to produce these documents, the Conservative House leader raised a point of privilege, rightly arguing that House privilege had been breached due to the failure to comply with the House order. On September 26, Speaker, you issued a ruling on the point of privilege raised and found that the privileges of the House had in fact been breached. Now, nearly a month later, we continue our important debate on this matter today and continue our demands for this Liberal government to provide the RCMP with the unredacted SDTC documents. Speaker, you have ruled this government has violated a House order to turn over evidence to the RCMP into the latest Liberal $400 million green slush fund scandal. The Liberal government's refusal to respect your ruling has paralyzed Parliament, pushing aside all other work to address issues such as the cruel and crippling carbon tax, the cost of living crisis Canadians face for food and shelter, and the increasing crime, disorder, and chaos in our streets and in our communities and cities. This is happening at a time when the cost of food, fuel, and shelter are all up, and millions of Canadians are having to line outside of food banks just to survive. Sadly, as Canadians continue to struggle, life for well-connected Liberal insiders has never been so good. One of the drivers of this hardship is the cruel NDP-Liberal carbon tax. In fact, the carbon tax will cost the average Ontarian $903 this year. This is completely unacceptable to the constituents in my communities of Niagara Falls, Niagara-on-the-Lake, and Fort Erie, who work hard for their money, who save carefully for their futures, and who dream of a better tomorrow. Instead of doing anything about climate change, the NDP-Liberal carbon tax is impoverishing Canadians. Recently, the PBO confirmed that Canadians will suffer a net cost, paying more in the carbon tax than they will ever get back in rebates. Unfortunately, the NDP-Liberal government doesn't care. Instead of giving Canadians the tax relief they deserve, they hiked the carbon tax by 23% last year as part of their plan to actually quadruple the carbon tax by 2030. Turns out the carbon tax is not a tool to fight climate change like the Prime Minister argues. It's just another tax grab. Canadians can add it to the long list of growing list of NDP-Liberal taxes they already pay, including the income tax, sales tax, excise tax, underutilized housing tax, property tax, capital gains tax, and more. After listing all those taxes, it's easy to see why Canadians are getting poor. It's because this government is taking more of their hard-earned money away. The STD scandal is also happening at a time when costs are up for food. In fact, food will cost families $700 more this year than it did in 2023. That's because when you tax the farmer who grows the food, the trucker who ships the food, and the store who stocks, stores, and sells the food, you end up taxing the family who buys the food. As Sylvain Charlebois, the food professor, director of Dalhousie University's Agri-Food Analytics Labs, has said, the costly NDP-Liberal carbon tax, quote, likely adds a significant cost burden to the Canadian food industry, close quote. When it comes to food, Canadians are going hungry. That's evident by the massive surge in demand and need at food banks. Food bank usage has increased every year this NDP-Liberal government has been in office because its inflationary spending and punishing carbon tax have hiked up the price for groceries, causing Canadians to skip meals, eat less healthy food, and rely on food banks to survive. This was confirmed recently by Feed Ontario, who revealed that a record 1 million people visited a food bank in Ontario in 2024. This is a dramatic increase of 25% from the previous year. In fact, Feed Ontario CEO told media, and I quote, "I never thought I would see this day." Feed Ontario CEO went on to say, "I've been with the organization 15 years, and I never thought we'd see this level of demand. I cannot believe we reached a point where numbers are so drastically high." Cross Canada Food Banks Canada reported earlier this year that they had seen a 50% increase in visits since 2021, with food banks handling a record 2 million visits in a single month in 2023. Of the people visiting food banks in Ontario, 1 in 3 visitors are children. Only 1 in 6 adults visiting food banks are unemployed. This NDP-Liberal government's cost of living crisis has become so severe that even working Canadians are having to depend on food banks to get by. These numbers reflect what is happening across Niagara, too. Madam Speaker, try to wrap your head around these statistics from Project Share, which serves vulnerable residents in Niagara Falls. Last year, Project Share saw a 20% increase in people served this year compared to the previous year. 4,740 people accessed their services for the first time. 120 families on average per day accessed their essential support services. 13,995 people were served last year, which equates to 1 in 7 residents in Niagara Falls having accessed their essential support services just last year. We should be debating these issues, Speaker, and we can if this government simply abided by your ruling and provided the documents this House has requested. Why are they so hesitant to do what is right? Is it that they do not want to speak to the situation facing young Canadians and first-time homebuyers, which is so bad that the Canadian dream of home ownership is dying? 2/3 of young people believe they will never be able to afford a home. Canadians see this housing crisis most tragically in our streets, where there are now 1,800 homeless encampments across Ontario and 1,000 more across the country. Time after time, the NDP-Liberal government has promised to fix the housing crisis. But the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation has been clear that the number of new homes being built isn't enough to reduce the existing supply gap and improve affordability for Canadians. Crime is also getting worse under the watch of this NDP-Liberal government. Perhaps, again, that is why they refuse to hand over these documents. So we cannot debate these issues, which are so important to all of our constituents. Since 2015, when the Liberals formed government, the number of auto thefts has skyrocketed by 45%. Violent crime has increased 50%. Hate crimes have increased by 251%. And just recently, the Toronto Police Association had to come out publicly and fact-check the Prime Minister. When the Prime Minister attempted to brag about banning firearms from law-abiding firearms owners while continuing to ignore the crime wave he has unleashed across the country, the Toronto Police Association reminded him that shootings are up 45% and gun-related homicides are up 62% in Toronto in just the last year. The reality is that the Liberal soft-on-crime approach is making life easier for violent criminals by repealing mandatory minimum sentences for gun crimes with Bill C-5 and making it easier to get bail with Bill C-75, and failing to stop the flow of illegal guns across the U.S. border. These issues I noted above all are all pressing issues which parliamentarians should be debating, but the House of Commons is seized because this government is refusing to comply with the House order to hand over SDTC documents to the RCMP. Speaker, Canadians are suffering great hardship after 9 years of this NDP-Liberal coalition. The country is headed in the wrong direction, and we are all worse off than we were about 10 years ago. Speaker, you have ruled that this government has violated a House order to turn over evidence to the RCMP into their latest Liberal $400 million green slush fund scandal. The Liberal government's refusal to respect your ruling has paralyzed Parliament, pushing aside all other debate. It's time for the Liberals to end their corrupt cover-up and provide the ordered documents to the police so Parliament can get back to work and Canadians can have the accountability they so rightly deserve. Thank you, Madam Speaker.